In the early afternoon today, the White House put out a stunning and honestly just sort of strange statement about Saudi Arabia and the murder of a Virginia resident and Washington Post journalist named Jamal Khashoggi. A couple of days ago, the Washington Post was first to report, and then a number of other news outlets subsequently were immediately able to confirm that the CIA has concluded that the murder of Jamal Khashoggi was ordered by the ruler of Saudi Arabia, by the country's crown prince. I think it's fair to say now that we now know why those CIA findings about this murder of a U.S. journalist were leaked to reporters in advance of this White House statement today from President Trump. Because, of course, President Trump was inevitably going to side with the murderers of this U.S. journalist. Of course, he was going to try to cast doubt on any evidence that Saudi Arabia, in fact, did this. And I don't want to get too deep into the politics of leaks in the service of national security, but because the CIA findings about Khashoggi's murder were leaked a couple of days ago, we know, thanks to those leaks, that the President of the United States today defied the findings of America's own intelligence community. He's actually publicly lying about whether or not the U.S. government and its intelligence agencies have concluded with any certainty that Khashoggi was murdered and by whom. Now that the president has put out this statement being like, guess we'll never know who killed him. We're certainly not going to blame Saudi Arabia. Now that the president has put out that statement, now we know why the CIA findings that Saudi Arabia and its ruler definitely ordered that murder, why those findings were leaked a couple of days in advance of this statement. Now we're left to figure out why the president is telling that lie, why he's going so far out of his way to cover for the country and specifically the ruler that carried out this killing of a U.S. resident and U.S. journalist. The publisher of the Washington Post said tonight in response to Trump's statement, quote, "The Central Intelligence Agency has thoroughly investigated the murder of this innocent journalist and concluded with high confidence that it was directed by the Crown Prince. If there is a reason to doubt the findings of the CIA, President Trump should immediately make that evidence public." Again, that's from the publisher of the Washington Post tonight. Khashoggi's editor at the Post was even more blunt tonight, quote, "Trump is doing his best to help the Saudi regime get away with the murder of a U.S. resident and one of the Arab world's most prominent writers. From Trump's failure to condemn white supremacists in Charlottesville to mocking a sexual assault victim, there have been many low points of this presidency, but turning a blind eye to the butchering of a U.S.-based journalist just may be one of the lowest." Again, that's from Khashoggi's editor tonight at the Washington Post. It remains an open question as to whether or not Congress might try to do something about this murder, even though the president now says he will not, because of the pressure on Congress that they should step up and respond to this murder, even though the president won't. Because of that pressure, I think we expect this story to continue to develop even through tonight and into the holiday weekend. I mean, this statement today from the White House, literally with all of its exclamation points and everything, this is just too absurd to be the last word from our country on this issue. So we will continue to watch that.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.